Howdy y'all. So I've talked a little bit before about some of my experiences in the United States Antarctic program, and I didn't get too deep into it, but I thought today we'd talk about cats on ice. And yeah, I mean caterpillars on ice, of course. We had different uses for different equipment all over the station, but today I'm going to focus on one in particular. We use dozers and ag tractors on the ice shelf to maintain the airfields, the NASA balloon facility, the snow roads. In town, we used a lot of loaders. We had dozers that stayed in town, cranes, stuff like that, rock drills, and then we also had the sea ice, which is what I'm going to talk about today. And the sea ice was a part of the science support. Fleet Ops is the department that I was initially an operator for and later the supervisor of. And what Fleet Ops would do on the sea ice was using the Caterpillar ag tractors, usually the Challengers. We would take what we called fish huts out onto the ice, and we would also drill dive holes for the divers to retrieve and study things under the ocean, under the sea ice. And they would dive down under the sea ice, and these huts are where they would warm up and do their dive prep, and it was just their shelter for the day on the ice. Now occasionally we would take dozers out on the ice, and the Corps of Engineers had different measurements that they used for weights and sizes of dozers and track widths and what cracks they could and couldn't cross, which was critical. And this had to be a known quantity before you took any piece of equipment out on the sea ice. And it depended on various factors such as the thickness of the ice, the crack you were crossing, how you were crossing it. The cracks move, you know, you would get different widths. And every time there was somebody had to go out on the ice, there was a field safety and training team that would make a route every year for everybody to follow to get to different locations where they wanted dive huts to study certain phenomenon under the sea ice in certain areas. And they would monitor the cracks, they would mark the cracks, and every time the cracks were crossed, we had to log the width of the crack. There was 2 bamboo poles we would measure in between. Anybody that was allowed to go out on the sea ice had to have a mandatory sea ice training, which was, in essence, I think it was about a day training, and we'd go out on the ice with the field safety and training folks and learn about cracks, learn how to spot cracks that weren't marked, look at the warning signs to look for. One of the follies that you had to watch for was what they called trapdoor ice, which was ice that had cracks going in different directions from it, and that could create the trapdoor effect. If you got a large piece of equipment on it, it would essentially flip over the trapdoor right on top of you. So those were the dangers of looking out for on the sea ice. Obviously there was safety protocols before you could travel on the sea ice. You had to check out with the fire department. You would log your time of departure, how many souls were on board, and you would log your estimated time of arrival back to station. And if you did not check in, they were coming looking for you. Anytime you went out on the sea ice, it was always a long day. I had a couple of very long days out on the sea ice. So you take your extreme cold weather gear with you, even if it's a nice day and you're not expecting weather, you always take it with you. Extra food, water, pee bottles. We're not allowed to pee anywhere in Antarctica. You had to collect it and take it back to station, yes, and number 2 as well. So those were some of the things that we would take when we would go out on the sea ice. And what we do is essentially tow a modified caisson rig with the ag tractor that had a 4-foot auger on it to drill a dive hole. And that's me drilling a dive hole. The protocol was that nobody could travel solo on the sea ice without permission from the station manager, which I don't ever recall anybody traveling solo. Maybe some of the science groups occasionally, but I don't recall it ever happening to my knowledge. Of course, sea ice has different radio channels too, that they have different repeaters that they have to use because they're further from the station for the radios to work. The auger would drill a hole, then what we called the carps, the carpenters, would come out and they would have like a piston bully with a blade on it, like this one if I have a picture, if I don't. But they would push the spoils off. We would go back to town with the ag tractor, return the drill, grab the fish hut that was designated for that dive hole, and we would tow it out and tow it on top, and that's where it would set. And then they would set up, there's heaters in there and other things the carpenters would put together, and then that's where the divers would work out of for the remainder of whatever time they needed for their study, or the remainder of the sea ice season, which was usually ending, I'd say, October, November, and it all depended on the weather. It depended on the thickness of the sea ice that we had. When I went out on the sea ice the first time, it was only 1 meter thick. That was not very thick for sea ice. Typically, sea ice, you want a little bit thicker than that, but it was thick enough for that tractor, for the weight of that tractor, for crossing tracks with that tractor and the other items that we were taking out on the sea ice. When you get out from the station that far away from civilization, you can't see anything. There's no planes in the sky. There's no people. There's no nothing. It's the closest thing that I would consider like being on another planet. Antarctica is the last frontier for a reason because of that, and you really get the concept of how isolated you are. If you work in the town in McMurdo, you really don't see it. You're around other people, you're in the galley. Once you get out on the sea ice, or those folks that go out to field camps and things, then you really realize just how isolated Antarctica is. One of the interesting things about sea ice as opposed to like a freshwater ice is sea ice can kind of repair itself. It's very elastic, and they've had time-lapse videos that I've seen in the sea ice training where that water, especially with the tide, it just kind of bends that ice, whereas a freshwater ice will fracture and move, and it won't typically repair itself on the cracks. Sea ice can repair itself. There are several known cracks that develop every year in the exact same place, and that's just because of the tides and the currents, and those are logged. And sadly, some of those cracks are named after items or people. I recall a Big John crack, I recall a Baco crack, Tent EGP, I think it was, something like that. But the scenery when you get out there, it is absolutely beautiful. And in McMurdo is Scott's Hut, is one of the historic places. It's still exactly the same as it was when Scott left it, down to the provisions that they have inside of there. But there's an additional one that the only way you can get to is by travel of sea ice. Now, I was never inside of that one, but I did get to see it from the outside, and it's absolutely beautiful. And just to show you the scenery, like here's a picture of on the sea ice, and behind me is the southernmost active volcano, Mount Erebus, which is right next to McMurdo Station. And also a lot of science expeditions are there because it's on a fault line that actually goes clear up into North Korea, and there's even some nuclear science experiments there that they can actually detect when North Korea lights off a nuclear weapon underneath the ground. They can actually hear it down there in Antarctica from those sensors. They're that sensitive. But I digress. Sea ice season can be very busy. I think the last time when I was out there in that picture where I was drilling the holes, there was only a few of us in the department that were trained to go out on the sea ice, and even though, you know, supervisor, but it was me and our lead blaster that went out, and we drilled some of the holes. It was a short season. The safety protocols on the sea ice are very strict and stringent, and very understandably so. There is a fire department team, there's a search and rescue team, there's the field and safety team, and if we found anomalies when we were out there, cracks that we didn't think were noted or anything, they were reported and they were documented and they were marked accordingly. As well as the routes that we're supposed to travel, they were marked with bamboo flags. Green and red usually were fine, and areas where you didn't want to go near or through were marked with a black flag, so that was danger. It was a black flag. If you didn't have black flags to put in there, and we would carry drills with what they called Covex bits to drill into the sea ice. You could check the depth of the ice with these bits, but we'd also plant flags. If you had maybe just green or red ones, you just cross them. So a cross flag was also considered a black flag. So you could measure the depth of the ice. We would drill through with those Covex bits, and there's a string with a little weight measuring thing on it, and you could put it down in there and it would flip out, and you could tug it back up, and you could measure the thickness of the ice, and then if you just tugged on it hard enough, it would fold it up and pull it up back through the ice. But that's how you could determine the measurements of the ice. If we encountered a crack, you could get out a shovel, you could shovel it off, measure it. You would want to look at, see if it was working, because there's different layers in the crack, so it would depend. You'd measure the distance it was apart, and that was also something that was calculated by the Corps of Engineers to know what vehicles you could actually cross with out there. You don't typically ever take wheeled vehicles out on the sea ice. The divers down there are very nice fellows. They've been doing it for years, very familiar with it, and very familiar with working with the science groups and getting them what they needed to study. And yes, they dive in that ice cold Antarctic water, and it's quite interesting, some of the pictures I've seen that they have taken underneath. Not only do they do dives for the science groups, they also do dives to check the infrastructure in and around McMurdo stations, and when we still built them, I don't think they do anymore, they use a causeway, but they would do inspections on the bottom of the ice pier and see how it was and how far away it was from the shoreline on the wharf underneath, if it was close to land, and they would check it for anomalies and issues. Another thing we would do was we would install an observation tube, which is got a hatch up on the top, and once you install it, like you drill the hole, you install this observation tube. It's weighted on the bottom so that the buoyancy level keeps the top up above the sea ice. It would freeze back in, and then you could actually get on a ladder, get down in there, and you could look around underneath the sea ice. It's absolutely beautiful. I did it once, my wife did it once. It's unlike anything you've ever seen. Very few people on this earth have gotten to see what it's like personally underneath sea ice. So we would install that sometimes, most years. It was built for a science group for a study, and I think somehow the Fleet Ops Department ended up in charge of it. The tractor of choice, at least for the sea ice, was the Caterpillar 95E Challengers. The Caterpillar Challenger tractors were the tractor of choice. They were also what was used for the traverses going to South Pole carrying cargo and fuel. Most of the time we would get old Traverse tractors. Generally Traverse got the new tractors first. Obviously they needed tractors that were a lot more mechanically sound for the length of the trip that they had to travel, whereas we could use those in station, the ones that were maybe not as durable, because we were close to field mechanics and mechanics. I actually really like the Challengers. Our neighbors out here across the road farm with one still. My understanding is, though, that they can't get parts for them anymore, so they're becoming kind of a thing of the past. Most of the new Cat tractors are built by Challenger, what I think is a subsidiary of Cat, but they use Cat engines, but not part of Cat. I'm not quite sure. And you might be asking what happens if the weather changes when you're out on the sea ice. Well, if it goes to like a condition 1, you shelter in place. So every vehicle that goes out on the sea ice is equipped with a survival kit that has a tent, a stove, meal provisions, enough that you can shelter in place until rescue can come. Generally, Before we go out on the sea ice, we would check with NIWC and see what the weather was supposed to be like for that day, and they were fairly accurate. So if there was a chance of severe weather and it was possible to postpone it, we would do that. But there were protocols in place if the weather changes, because if the wind starts blowing and it blows that dry, powdery snow, you cannot see where you're going, and it's very easy to get lost very quick. And that's not just on the sea ice, but also on the Ross Ice Shelf, which is adjacent to McMurdo Station. I had even seen Condition 1 weather in McMurdo Station, where it's a little more rare, mostly Condition 2s. In the winter, they get a lot more. But you can't see this far in front of your face. It's just that bad. It's just completely white out. And if you're not wearing goggles, those ice crystals hurt your eyes when they hit them. I loved my time in the program. I loved the adventure. If things were different, I'd probably still want to be there, but things are different now. I'm a YouTuber now, and I'm doing this for Hanky, so this is a lot of fun, and I feel like I'm doing something important. Wanted to mention one of the other hazards on the sea ice is if you get, what did they call it? I think it was called freeboard ice or something, where if you get hydraulic pressure that gets water on top of the ice, that's another thing, and that can be hidden sometimes because there's snow on top of the ice with water underneath of it on top of the sea ice, and that adds to the weight of the ice, and that can be a little bit more of a dangerous situation. So that's also something that you need to watch out for on the sea ice. Of course, the sea ice training, that's on top of Antarctic field safety training that everybody on station receives. We also receive GPS training when you go on the sea ice, because we follow GPS, but we also have the route flagged. So the GPS can come in handy if the weather is iffy. You can still see, but you want to make sure you're coming back or going where you need to go. Another thing that the Fleet Ops Department did was maintain what we called the transitions. So that was the area between the land and the sea ice, because of course the tide's moving constantly. And what we would do is build that up with new, fresh, white snow out into the sea ice so that it would more or less bridge that with snow. And of course you're going out there with tracked vehicles, it was less of an issue. But during the end of the season, towards the end of the sea ice season, it got a little bit difficult to find fresh white snow. So we would always try to stockpile some near there where we could get to it. When I say white snow, it was absolutely critical to get the cleanest snow you can get. Now there's no dirt in Antarctica, it's volcanic rock and dust. But that volcanic rock and dust is very dark black or dark red, and you would get what you call solar gain. So a pebble the size of my little finger could get enough solar gain absorption that it gets warm and it can melt a pothole that's as big as a Volkswagen car if it's not maintained. So white snow, clean snow was absolutely imperative on the transitions, but it was even more imperative on the runways and the snow roads. Over the years, the sea ice isn't quite as thick and quite as robust as it used to be, but at one point they used to land fully loaded aircraft on the sea ice down there, and I was never there. They quit doing that, I think, the year before my first year. That was Pegasus, I think they called it, airfield, and they had a shortcut to Pegasus that would actually go from town out onto the sea ice instead of going around on the ice shelf. And yes, that sea ice under the right conditions would absolutely hold up a jet aircraft that was fully loaded. There were times we got stuck on the sea ice. It happened, like you'd get into some very thick snow that maybe the tractor couldn't pull. So we would check with field and safety and training and maybe take out a D6D or even a little D4 and dig it out, or a piston bully with a blade and dig it out and get it freed up and get it home. The mechanics also had to have sea ice training so that they could come out and render assistance or repair if needed on any of the equipment. Fleet Ops Department, at the time I was there, they had basically 2 tractors that could be used on the sea ice, and they were shared assets with the airfield. So they got juggled a lot. and because the airfield, for the same reasons, needed the tracked ag tractor. And of course, these Challengers are rubber track. The tracks that we used had to be special tracks. They were actually a very soft rubber when they were in warm temperatures, but in the cold they would get very hard and brittle. You couldn't really use the standard tracks that like they would use around here for farming. Those wore excessively, so they had to be a little bit more elastic, more similar to the rubber like they use in a race car drag strip tire. They're very soft. The Case quad tracks seem to be a little bit more susceptible track-wise to that kind of wear than the Cat Challengers. I probably rambled and meandered a little bit, but I hope you enjoyed it. It's a very cool place. It's very cool science that they're doing, and I do miss it. I miss the department. I got a bunch more stuff coming. Thanks for watching.